The radio crackle came at 3:47 hours, and every controller in the Tactical Operations Center felt their stomach drop. A Navy SEAL team, call sign Trident 6, had been compromised deep in the Nuristan Province mountains, pinned down in a canyon so narrow the satellite imagery looked like a knife wound in the earth. They had maybe 20 minutes before the insurgent forces closed the ring completely. The quick reaction force was 30 minutes out. The Apache gunships were grounded by a sandstorm rolling in from the west, and the only asset within range was a single A-10 Thunderbolt II, call sign Reaper 7, piloted by someone most of the command staff had never heard of. The mission commander, a colonel with 3 combat deployments and a chest full of ribbons, stared at the tactical display and asked the question everyone was thinking. Who the hell is Reaper 7? The response came back flat, almost apologetic. Captain Nyla Kavar, sir. She's been flying Overwatch missions for the past 6 months, mostly convoy escort, some route reconnaissance. No close air support on her record. The colonel's jaw tightened. Below them in the canyon, 8 SEALs were burning through their ammunition, calling out target distances in clipped, desperate voices. They needed someone who could thread a needle at 400 knots, someone who could put 30mm rounds within meters of friendly positions without hesitation. They needed a gunfighter, not a traffic cop. But Reaper 7 was already inbound, and there wasn't time to pull someone else off station. The controller keyed the radio, his voice carefully neutral. Reaper 7, Overwatch. Be advised, friendlies are danger close. Repeat, danger close. Target reference northwest ridgeline. Enemy squad in tree line approximately 50 meters from friendly position. The response came back immediately, and it wasn't the voice they expected. Calm, measured, with the faintest trace of a Central European accent. Overwatch, Reaper 7 copies all. Inbound from southeast, requesting updated grid and friendly marker. No hesitation, no uncertainty. The colonel leaned forward. On the ground, the SEAL team leader, a master chief named Delvecchio, heard the call sign and felt something cold settle into his chest. He'd heard stories about Reaper 7. Most of them weren't flattering. The word around Bagram was that Kavar was competent enough, technically sound, but that she'd never been tested, never had to make the hard calls. Some of the fixed-wing guys joked that she flew like she was delivering mail, always by the book, never taking risks. And now his team's lives depended on her. He pressed his radio transmit button, his voice tight. Reaper 7, Trident 6. We're at grid November Kilo 734821, marked with infrared strobe. Hostiles advancing from treeline northwest, approximately 75 meters and closing. We need fire now. There was a pause, just long enough for Delvecchio to feel his pulse hammering in his ears. Then Kavar's voice came back, and it carried a weight that made everyone listening sit up straighter. Trident 6, Reaper, I have your strobe, rolling in hot. The A-10 appeared over the ridgeline like something summoned from a nightmare, low enough that the SEALs could see the moonlight reflecting off the titanium bathtub surrounding the cockpit. The aircraft was ugly in the way that purpose-built killing machines are ugly, all hard angles and exposed ordnance. The 7-barrel GAU-8 Avenger, cannon protruding from its nose like the tusk of some prehistoric predator. Kavar brought the Warthog into a banking turn so tight the wingtips seemed to scrape the canyon walls. Her eyes locked on the infrared display showing the SEAL positions as green diamonds and the enemy fighters as red clusters spreading through the trees. She'd studied this terrain during her pre-flight brief, memorized the elevations, the wind patterns, the dead spaces where the mountains created radar shadows. Now all of that data compressed into a single firing solution that existed for maybe 3 seconds before the geometry changed. Her thumb hovered over the trigger. 75 meters. In close air support doctrine, anything under 200 meters was considered danger close. Anything under 100 was insanity. The margin for error was measured in single-digit meters, and the GAU-8 fired at a rate of 65 rounds per second. One twitch, one moment of overcorrection, and she'd be putting depleted uranium rounds through American bodies. The targeting pipper drifted across her heads-up display, steadying on the tree line. She could hear Delvecchio's voice in her headset, calling out distances, his tone stripped of everything except survival arithmetic. 50 meters, Reaper. They're in the open, moving fast. Kavar's breathing slowed, her heartbeat dropping into the rhythm she'd learned during 1,000 hours of training. The A-10 steadied, the nose dipping fractionally as she compensated for wind shear rolling down the canyon. Then she squeezed the trigger, and the world turned into thunder. The GAU-8 unleashed a burst that lasted exactly 1.7 seconds, but in that fragment of time, it transformed the northwest tree line into a storm of splintered wood and shattered earth. The sound wasn't quite like anything else in modern warfare, a deep, ripping roar that seemed to come from the ground itself, as if the canyon had opened up and started screaming. The 30-millimeter rounds, each one the size of a beer bottle, impacted in a line so precise it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler, stitching through the enemy position with mathematical brutality. In the Tactical Operations Center, the controller watching the infrared feed saw the red clusters simply disappear, replaced by heat blooms that faded as quickly as they'd appeared. The colonel, still standing behind him, said nothing. On the ground, Delvecchio and his team pressed themselves into the earth as the shock wave rolled over them, feeling the percussion in their chests, tasting dust and cordite. Before the echo faded, Kavar had already pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, her eyes scanning for secondary targets, for muzzle flashes, for any indication that the enemy force was regrouping. The Warthog climbed sluggishly, fighting the thin mountain air, and she pushed the throttles forward, coaxing every ounce of thrust from the twin turbofans. Below, Delvecchio keyed his radio, his voice raw. Reaper 7, Trident. Good hits, good hits. Enemy neutralized on northwest axis. We've got movement on the eastern ridgeline now, approximately 200 meters, looks like reinforcements. Kavar's response was immediate. Copy, Trident, coming around. She banked the aircraft hard, the G-forces pressing her into the seat, and began setting up for another gun run. The A-10 wasn't fast, wasn't elegant, but it was responsive in a way that newer fighters weren't. Every control input translated directly into movement without the mediation of fly-by-wire systems. It felt alive under her hands, like riding something feral that had agreed, temporarily, to cooperate. The eastern ridgeline came into view, and she could see the muzzle flashes now, sparks of light in the darkness where the insurgents were firing down into the canyon. She armed a pair of Mark 82 500-pound bombs, her thumb moving across the weapon's panel with practiced efficiency. The targeting system locked, the pipper steadying on the ridgeline, and she pickled the bombs off in a smooth, continuous motion. They fell in a lazy arc, tumbling slightly before the fins deployed and steadied their trajectory. Kavar didn't wait to see the impact. She was already pulling up, climbing away from the canyon floor, when the explosions lit up the mountainside like twin suns. The shockwave rolled outward in a perfect sphere, pulverizing rock and vegetation, and when it cleared, the eastern ridgeline was silent. In the Tactical Operations Center, someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The colonel's expression hadn't changed, but his posture had. He wasn't leaning forward anymore, wasn't second-guessing. He was watching. On the radio, Delvecchio's voice came through, steadier now. Reaper 7, Trident 6, outstanding. We've got breathing room. Can you stay on station? Kavar checked her fuel gauge, did the mental arithmetic. She had maybe 40 minutes of loiter time before she'd have to break off for tanker support. Affirm, Trident. I'm not going anywhere. For the next 30 minutes, Kavar orbited the canyon in a pattern so tight she could see the individual faces of the SEAL team through her targeting pod when she zoomed in. She didn't make small talk, didn't ask unnecessary questions. She just flew, keeping the A-10 between the team and anything that moved in the surrounding mountains. Twice more, enemy fighters tried to press the attack, and twice more, she put them down with bursts from the GAU-8 that were so precise the SEALs barely felt the vibration. The insurgents began to pull back, recognizing the futility of advancing into a kill zone dominated by an aircraft that seemed to know where they were before they did. In the Tactical Operations Center, the other pilots started filtering in, drawn by the radio chatter, by the reports coming back from the SEAL team. They stood in clusters, watching the feed, listening to Kavar's transmissions. Most of them had flown with her, had seen her in the briefing rooms, had formed opinions based on limited data and mess hall gossip. Now they watched as she turned the canyon into a demonstration of what close air support was supposed to look like when executed by someone who understood that the difference between life and death was measured in seconds and meters. One of the Apache pilots, a warrant officer named Ortiz who'd once joked that Kavar flew like she was afraid to scratch the paint, stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Another pilot, a Marine Harrier jock who transferred in from Kandahar, shook his head slowly. "She's been holding back," he said quietly. "That whole time she's been holding back." The colonel didn't respond, but he didn't disagree. At 4:23 hours, the Quick Reaction Force finally arrived, their helicopters thundering into the canyon with door gunners scanning for targets that were no longer there. Delvecchio's team began moving toward the extraction point, maintaining tactical spacing, still expecting contact. But the mountains were quiet now, the insurgents scattered or dead, and when the helicopters lifted off 6 minutes later, every SEAL was accounted for. Kavar stayed on station until the helicopters were clear of the valley, then turned southwest toward Bagram, her fuel gauge needle hovering just above the red line. The sun was starting to rise, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold, and for a moment the war looked almost beautiful. The landing at Bagram came at 5:12 hours, the A-10 touching down with the controlled violence that characterized all Warthog landings. Kavar taxied to the revetment, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, her hands still on the controls, feeling the adrenaline slowly draining out of her system. She'd been flying for nearly 9 hours, the last 2 in continuous combat operations, and her body felt like it had been wrung out and hung up to dry. When she finally climbed down from the cockpit, the crew chief was waiting, his face unreadable. He walked around the aircraft, inspecting the carbon scoring around the gun barrel, the empty hardpoints where the Mark 82s had been, the hydraulic fluid leaking from a line that had taken shrapnel from ground fire Kavar hadn't even noticed. He looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd arrived at Bagram 6 months ago, there was something in his eyes that looked like respect. "You put some work in tonight, Captain," he said. Kavar nodded, too tired for more than that, and headed toward the debriefing room. She expected the usual routine, the fill-in-the-blanks mission report, the technical questions about ordnance expenditure and fuel consumption. What she found instead was a room full of pilots, some of them still in their flight suits, all of them looking at her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to something that might have been awe. The colonel was there too, standing near the front of the room with his arms crossed. He didn't smile, didn't offer congratulations, but when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made everyone listen. "Captain Kavar, the SEAL team you supported tonight has requested a formal commendation. Master Chief Delvecchio specifically stated that without your actions, his team would have taken casualties, possibly fatalities. That's not language they use lightly." Kavar stood at attention, unsure how to respond. She'd done her job, executed the mission profile exactly as briefed, put rounds on target when and where they were needed. That was what she was trained to do. The fact that it had worked, that everyone had come home, felt less like an achievement and more like the baseline expectation. But the room didn't see it that way. They saw something else, something they'd missed before. One of the Harrier pilots, the same one who'd watched the feed in the operations center, raised his hand slightly. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Kavar looked at the Harrier pilot, and for a moment she considered giving him the simple answer, the one that didn't require explanation or context. But these men had just watched her do something they'd underestimated her capacity for, and maybe they deserved more than deflection. "I grew up in Split," she said, her accent slightly more pronounced now that exhaustion was setting in. "My father was a MiG-21 pilot for the Croatian Air Force, back when that meant something different than it does now. He taught me to fly in a Zeeland 242 when I was 14, before the airfield got shelled and we had to leave. I came to the United States when I was 16, Joined the Air Force at 18 and I've been flying ever since." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "In my country, when you flew, you didn't get second chances. The margins were small, the equipment was old, and if you made a mistake, there was usually no one coming to help you. So you learned to be very, very precise. You learned that the aircraft was a tool, and the tool was only as good as your understanding of what it could do." The room was silent. The Harrier pilot nodded slowly, processing that. The colonel's expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had relaxed fractionally. Another pilot, an F-16 jock with a call sign patch that read Pyro, spoke up from the back of the room. "Why Reaper 7? That call sign doesn't exactly scream Overwatch missions." Kavar allowed herself a small, tired smile. "I didn't choose it. My first squadron commander gave it to me after a training exercise where I put simulated rounds through a target building with 6 friendlies inside and didn't scratch any of them. He said I flew like I was harvesting souls, but only the ones I was supposed to." There were a few chuckles, the tension in the room easing slightly, but the respect remained, settling into place like a foundation that hadn't existed before. Ortiz, the Apache pilot who joked about her flying, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, for what it's worth, I owe you an apology. We've been giving you shit for months, and that wasn't fair." Kavar met his eyes, and her expression softened. "You didn't know. None of you did. I've been flying cargo escort and route reconnaissance because that's what they assigned me to do. I didn't complain, didn't ask for different missions. Maybe I should have." The debrief lasted another 20 minutes, technical questions about the engagement, about ammunition expenditure and battle damage assessment. Kavar answered each one with the same calm precision she'd used in the cockpit, walking the assembled pilots through her decision-making process, explaining why she'd chosen gun runs over guided munitions for most of the engagement, why she'd kept her altitude low despite the risk of ground fire. It wasn't bravado, wasn't showmanship. It was pedagogy, one professional explaining their craft to others who understood the stakes. When it was over, the colonel dismissed everyone except Kavar. The room cleared quickly, pilots filing out in small groups, their conversations already shifting to what they'd just witnessed. When the door closed, the colonel sat down across from her, his expression finally softening into something almost human. "You know they're going to see you differently now," he said. "Not just here, but everywhere. Word spreads fast in the aviation community. By tomorrow morning, every A-10 pilot in theater is going to know your call sign and what you did tonight." Kavar nodded. She'd expected that. The military ran on stories, on legends built from moments of exceptional performance under pressure. She'd just become one of those stories, whether she wanted to be or not. "I didn't do it for recognition, sir," she said quietly. "I did it because 8 men were about to die, and I had the training and the equipment to stop that from happening." The colonel studied her for a long moment. "I know, that's what makes it matter." He stood, and she stood with him. "Get some rest, Captain. I have a feeling you're going to be busy." She saluted, he returned it, and she walked out into the pre-dawn light feeling the weight of something shifting inside her chest. For 6 months she'd been invisible, competent, but unremarkable, a name on a flight roster that nobody paid much attention to. Now she was something else. Now she was Reaper 7, the pilot who'd saved Trident 6 in a canyon so narrow the satellite imagery looked like a scar. She walked toward her quarters, the base beginning to wake around her, and tried to convince herself that nothing fundamental had changed. But she knew better. Everything had changed. The sky was the same, the aircraft was the same, but the way people would see her, the weight they'd place on her call sign, that was different now. And there was no going back. The story should have ended there, with Kavar returning to her quarters, filing her mission report, and slipping back into the rotation of overwatch and escort missions. But the military doesn't forget performances like the one in the Nuristan Canyon, and within 48 hours, her name was being passed around command staff meetings at levels far above Bagram. The formal commendation from Trident 6 arrived first, a document signed by Master Chief Del Vecchio and countersigned by his commanding officer, stating in precise military language that Captain Nyla Kavar had demonstrated exceptional airmanship and tactical judgment under combat conditions, and that her actions had directly prevented friendly casualties. Then came the mission tasking change. Kavar was pulled from routine overwatch and reassigned to a quick reaction force rotation, placed on standby for troops in contact situations where the margins were thin and the stakes were absolute. It was the assignment most A-10 pilots coveted, the one that separated the technicians from the gunfighters. She'd earned it in a single night, but now she had to prove it wasn't a fluke. The other pilots in her squadron adjusted quickly. The jokes stopped. The sidelong glances in the briefing room disappeared. When she walked into the operations center, people made space for her, listened when she spoke, asked her opinion on flight profiles and weapons loadouts. Ortiz, the Apache pilot, started sitting with her during mission planning sessions, asking questions about gun run geometry and target selection that he'd never bothered to ask before. The Harrier pilot, call sign Torch, invited her to join a group of fixed-wing pilots for dinner at the dining facility, a small gesture that meant more than he probably realized. But there were others who didn't adjust, who saw her sudden prominence as an aberration, a fluke of circumstance rather than an indication of skill. One of them was a major named Haddock, an F-15E Strike Eagle pilot with 12 years of service and a chest full of air medals. He'd built his reputation on precision strikes, on dropping guided munitions from 30,000 feet with surgical accuracy, and he viewed close air support as a necessary but unsophisticated mission set, something best left to the A-10 drivers who didn't have the performance envelope for real fighter work. 3 days after the Canyon mission, Haddock cornered Kavar in the operations center, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. "Heard you had a good night in Nuristan," he said. His tone was congratulatory, but there was an edge underneath, something that felt like a challenge. Kavar looked up from the mission brief she was reviewing, her expression polite but guarded. She'd dealt with men like Haddock before, pilots who measured their worth in speed and altitude rather than effectiveness. "It went well," she said simply. "The SEAL team made it out, that's what mattered." Haddock leaned against the table, his posture casual but his eyes sharp. Sure, but let's be real, you got lucky. Danger close work in a canyon like that, one wrong input and you're killing friendlies. The fact that everyone walked away doesn't mean it was the right call. It just means the dice came up in your favor." The room went very quiet. Other pilots who'd been working nearby stopped what they were doing, not looking directly at the exchange but listening intently. Kavar set down her mission brief, her movements deliberate. She didn't raise her voice, didn't let irritation show on her face. She just looked at Haddock with the same calm intensity she'd used while lining up gun runs in the dark. "With respect, Major, it wasn't luck. It was geometry, weapons performance data, and about 8,000 hours of flight time. I knew the ballistics of the GAU-8, knew the dispersion pattern at that range and altitude. I calculated the offset for wind shear and terrain masking, and I executed the run exactly as planned. If you think that's luck, then you don't understand the platform or the mission set." Haddock's expression tightened. He'd expected deference, maybe a modest acknowledgement of risk. He hadn't expected to be corrected, and certainly not in front of other pilots. "The A-10 is a great aircraft for permissive environments," he said, his tone cooling. "But let's not pretend it's anything more than a gun truck with wings. You were in the right place at the right time, flying an aircraft designed for a Cold War that never happened. That doesn't make you a tactician." Kavar stood, and even though Haddock was taller, the movement shifted the dynamic in the room. The A-10 is still flying combat missions 30 years after it was supposed to be retired because it does a job that no other aircraft can do as well. It loiters longer, carries more ordnance, takes more punishment, and puts rounds on target with a precision that your Strike Eagle can't match in the close air support role. I'm not saying it's better. I'm saying it's different, and the mission I flew required different. Trident 6 didn't need a bomb from 30,000 feet. They needed a gun run from 300, and that's what I gave them. The room stayed silent, but the tension had shifted. Haddock seemed to realize he'd overplayed his hand, that challenging Kavar's competence 3 days after she'd saved 8 men wasn't going to win him any allies. He straightened, his expression smoothing into something more neutral. "Fair enough, Captain. I'm sure you'll get plenty more chances to prove yourself." He walked away, and the conversations in the room slowly resumed, but everyone knew what had just happened. A line had been drawn and Kavar had defended it without flinching. Ortiz, who'd been standing near the coffee station, walked over and sat down next to her. "Haddock's an ass," he said quietly, "but he's got friends in the command structure. You just made things harder for yourself." Kavar picked up her mission brief again, her expression unchanging. "I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to fly." Ortiz nodded slowly, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, well, you're doing that part pretty well." Over the next 2 weeks, Kavar flew 6 more missions, 3 of them troops in contact scenarios where she provided close air support for ground forces under fire. None of them were as dramatic as the Canyon mission, but each one was executed with the same methodical precision, the same calm professionalism that was quickly becoming her signature. She didn't showboat, didn't take unnecessary risks. She just put ordnance on target when and where it was needed, communicated clearly with ground forces, and brought the A-10 home with enough fuel to do it again if necessary. The reputation built incrementally, mission by mission, radio transmission by radio transmission. Ground commanders started requesting her by call sign. "We want Reaper 7" became a phrase that appeared in mission tasking orders, a recognition that competence was a finite resource and that some pilots delivered it more consistently than others. The command staff noticed, and so did the other pilots. The squadron operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Briggs, pulled her aside one afternoon after a mission debrief. "You're making us look good, Kavar," he said. "Keep it up, and you'll be up for a medal before the deployment's over." Kavar didn't know how to respond to that. Medals felt abstract, disconnected from the actual work of keeping people alive. So she just nodded and said, "Thank you, sir," and went back to studying the next day's flight schedule. But the deployment wasn't over, and the war had a way of testing people in ways they couldn't predict. On a Thursday morning in late spring, Kavar was sitting in the ready room when the alert klaxon sounded, the piercing wail that meant troops were in contact and needed immediate air support. She was suited up and running toward the revetment within 90 seconds, her crew chief already pulling the intake covers off the A-10 by the time she arrived. "What have we got?" she shouted over the noise of the engine spooling up. "Army patrol, call sign Sabre 12, pinned down in a village 20 clicks northeast," the crew chief shouted back. "Heavy contact, possibly a platoon-sized enemy force. They're calling for everything we've got." Kavar climbed into the cockpit, her hands moving through the startup checklist with automatic efficiency. They came alive around her, instruments lighting up, hydraulic systems pressurizing, the twin turbofans building thrust. She taxied out without waiting for clearance, knowing that in a troops-in-contact situation, every second mattered. The tower controller didn't object, just cleared her for immediate takeoff, and she was airborne 30 seconds later, the Warthog clawing for altitude as she turned northeast. The flight to the contact site took 8 minutes, and she spent every second of it reviewing the tactical data streaming into her displays. Sabre 12 was a mechanized infantry unit, 3 Bradley fighting vehicles and approximately 20 dismounted soldiers, caught in a horseshoe ambush in a village surrounded by low hills. The enemy had the high ground, firing down into the village with machine guns and RPGs, and the American forces were trapped with limited cover and dwindling ammunition. The situation was deteriorating fast. Kavar checked in with the ground commander, a first lieutenant named Ramos whose voice was tight with stress. "Reaper 7, Sabre 12, we've got heavy fire from the north and east ridgelines. We're suppressed, taking casualties, need immediate fire support." "Sabre 12, Reaper 7, I'm 2 minutes out. Marking your position now with infrared strobe. Do not move from cover." She pushed the throttles forward, dropping the A-10's nose into a shallow dive that brought her screaming toward the village at 400 knots. The ridgelines came into view, and she could see the muzzle flashes, bright points of light against the brown hillsides where the insurgents were firing down into the village. Kavar set up for a gun run on the northern ridgeline, her hands steady on the controls despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The targeting pipper drifted across her heads-up display, locking onto the cluster of muzzle flashes, and she squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared, sending a stream of 30mm rounds into the hillside with the force of an industrial shredder. Rock and dirt exploded outward, and the muzzle flashes disappeared. She pulled up, banking hard to the east, already lining up the next run. But something was wrong. The aircraft felt sluggish, the controls mushy in a way they shouldn't be. She glanced at her instruments and saw the hydraulic pressure gauge dropping, the needle sliding into the yellow zone. She'd taken ground fire, probably from a heavy machine gun, and one of the hydraulic lines had been hit. The A-10 was designed to take punishment, redundant systems layered on redundant systems, but hydraulic failure meant she was flying on borrowed time. She keyed the radio. Overwatch, Reaper 7. I've taken battle damage, hydraulics degrading, continuing mission. The response came back immediately. Reaper 7, Overwatch. Copy battle damage. Recommend you abort and return to base. Kavar looked down at the village, at the infrared markers showing the American positions, at the enemy forces still pouring fire into the trapped soldiers. She thought about the 8 SEALs in the canyon, about the weight of other people's lives resting on decisions made in fractions of seconds. Negative, Overwatch. Saber 1-2 still in contact. I've got one more run in me. She didn't wait for a response. She rolled the A-10 into another dive, the eastern ridgeline filling her windscreen, and fired again. The cannon roared, the aircraft shuddering with the recoil, and she watched the rounds impact in a perfect line across the enemy position. Then the hydraulics failed completely. The control stick went dead in her hands, the aircraft transitioning from powered flight to something closer to a ballistic trajectory. She was at 3,000 feet, traveling at 400 knots, with no hydraulic pressure and no way to maneuver. The A-10 began to roll inverted, the nose dropping, and for a moment, Kavar felt the cold certainty of knowing she was about to die. But then training took over, muscle memory built from thousands of hours in the cockpit. She reached for the backup controls, the mechanical cables that ran directly from the stick to the control surfaces, a redundancy built into the A-10 because the designers knew it would fly in environments where everything else failed. The manual reversion system engaged with a heavy clunk, and suddenly she had control again, limited and crude but real. The aircraft was still rolling, still descending, but she could influence it now, could arrest the spin and level the wings. She hauled back on the stick with both hands, feeling the cable tension through her arms, and the A-10 responded sluggishly, the nose coming up just enough to transition from a death spiral into a controlled descent. She was at 1,500 feet now, still dropping, the village flashing past beneath her. The twin turbofans were still running, still producing thrust, and she used every bit of it to shallow out the descent angle. She wasn't going to make it back to base. She knew that immediately. The aircraft was too damaged, too compromised, but she might be able to keep it in the air long enough to get clear of the village, to avoid crashing into the American forces or the civilian buildings. She keyed the radio, her voice steady despite the fact that she was riding a dying aircraft through the sky at 300 feet. Overwatch, Reaper 7. I'm going down. Estimate impact northeast of village, approximately 2 clicks, initiating emergency procedures. The radio exploded with voices, controllers, and pilots all talking at once, but Kavar tuned them out. She had one job left, and that was to put the A-10 down without killing anyone else in the process. The ground rushed up, brown and unforgiving, and she picked a stretch of open terrain, a dry riverbed that looked flat enough to attempt a belly landing. She didn't have landing gear, didn't have flaps, didn't have half the systems that would normally make this survivable. She just had momentum and the manual controls and a titanium bathtub wrapped around her that had been designed to take hits from anti-aircraft fire. She pulled the nose up fractionally, bleeding off speed, and then the A-10 hit the ground. The impact was catastrophic, the aircraft skipping once, twice, then slamming down hard enough to compress her spine and crack her helmet against the canopy frame. Metal screamed, tearing and folding, and she felt the world spinning even though the aircraft had stopped moving. Then everything went black, and the last thing she heard was the hiss of leaking hydraulic fluid and the distant sound of gunfire still echoing across the village. In the Tactical Operations Center at Bagram, the controllers watched Kavar's transponder signal disappear from their screens, and for a long moment no one spoke. The colonel who'd been monitoring the mission from the beginning stood frozen, his expression locked somewhere between horror and disbelief. On the radio, Lieutenant Ramos's voice came through, shaken but urgent. Overwatch, Sabre 1-2. Reaper 7 is down approximately 2 clicks northeast of our position. We're observing smoke. Requesting immediate CSAR, combat search and rescue, the protocol for recovering downed pilots. The colonel snapped out of his paralysis and started issuing orders, tasking helicopters, coordinating with the ground forces, pulling every available asset toward the crash site. But in the back of his mind, he was doing the math, calculating distances and response times and survival probabilities. Kavar had gone down in hostile territory, surrounded by the same insurgent forces she'd been engaging. If she'd survived the crash, she had maybe 10 minutes before they reached her, maybe less. At the village, Ramos made the decision without hesitation. He grabbed his squad leaders, pointed northeast toward the column of smoke rising from the riverbed, and started moving. They were still taking sporadic fire from the ridgelines, but the enemy had been broken by Kavar's gun runs, scattered and disorganized. Ramos's soldiers moved fast, bounding between cover positions, suppressing targets as they appeared, closing the distance to the crash site with disciplined aggression. They found the A-10 3 minutes later, and it looked like something that had fallen from orbit. The fuselage was crumpled, the wings bent at unnatural angles, hydraulic fluid and fuel pooling in the dirt around the wreckage. The canopy was cracked but intact, and through the smoke they could see movement inside. Ramos reached the cockpit first, climbing onto the twisted metal, and looked down at Kavar. She was conscious barely, her face pale and blood running from a gash above her left eye. But she was alive, and when she saw him she tried to smile. "Sabre 1-2, she said, her voice hoarse. "Did you get them? Did we get them?" Ramos felt something crack inside his chest, looking at this pilot who'd just flown a dying aircraft into the ground and whose first concern was whether the mission had succeeded. "Yeah, Captain," he said, his voice tight. "We got them, now let's get you out of here." The extraction took 4 minutes, Ramos and his soldiers pulling Kavar from the cockpit and carrying her away from the wreckage as the smoke thickened, and the fuel pooled dangerously close to the hot metal of the engines. They set her down 50 meters away, and the platoon medic went to work, checking for spinal injuries, stabilizing her neck, calling out vitals in the clipped shorthand of combat medicine. Kavar stayed conscious through all of it, her eyes tracking the soldiers moving around her, and when she heard the distinctive thump of rotor blades approaching, she knew the CSAR bird was inbound. The Pave Hawk helicopter landed in a whirlwind of dust and noise, the pararescue jumpers spilling out with a litter and medical gear. They loaded Kavar in less than a minute, efficient and professional, and then the helicopter was lifting off, turning southwest toward Bagram with an Apache escort flying low cover. Inside the cabin, one of the PJs, a staff sergeant named Hollies, worked on Kavar's injuries while another monitored her vitals. She'd broken 3 ribs, fractured her left wrist, and had a concussion that was going to hurt for weeks. But she was stable, and barring complications, she was going to make it. Hollies leaned close, speaking loudly over the noise of the rotors. "You're one lucky pilot, ma'am. That was a hell of a landing." Kavar looked at him, her vision swimming slightly from the concussion. "Wasn't luck," she said quietly. "That aircraft was built to take punishment. I just flew it." Hollies grinned despite himself. "Yeah, well, you flew it into the ground and walked away. I'd call that luck." Kavar closed her eyes, exhaustion finally catching up with her. "I didn't walk. You carried me." The helicopter touched down at Bagram 18 minutes later, and Kavar was transferred to the base hospital, where a team of doctors and nurses went to work cataloging her injuries and stabilizing her for potential medical evacuation to Germany. The word spread fast, rippling through the base like a shockwave. Reaper 7 was down, but she was alive. She'd taken battle damage, lost hydraulics, and still completed her mission before putting the aircraft into the dirt in a controlled crash that should have killed her but didn't. The story grew in the telling, details accumulating, and by the time the sun set that evening, every pilot on the base knew what had happened. The colonel visited her in the hospital the next morning, standing at the foot of her bed with his arms crossed and an expression that was hard to read. Kavar was awake, her head wrapped in bandages, her left wrist in a cast, but her eyes were clear. "How are you feeling, Captain?" he asked. Kavar considered the question. Her ribs hurt with every breath, her head throbbed, and her wrist felt like someone had taken a hammer to it. But she was alive, and the soldiers in the village were alive, and that seemed like the only metric that mattered. "I've been worse, sir," she said. The colonel almost smiled at that. "The A-10 is a complete loss. Salvage team says it's not worth recovering, so they're going to strip the avionics and leave the rest for the scrappers. But the aircraft did its job. It got you down and kept you alive." Kavar nodded. She'd known the Warthog was gone the moment the hydraulics failed, but hearing it confirmed still hurt in a way she hadn't expected. That aircraft had been her tool, her weapon, her lifeline, and it had given everything it had to keep her and those soldiers alive. "What about Sabre 1-2?" she asked. "All accounted for. 2 minor injuries, but everyone made it out. Lieutenant Ramos is writing you up for a medal. So is Master Chief Del Vecchio, apparently. Your name is getting passed around command levels I didn't even know existed." Kavar closed her eyes, suddenly exhausted. "I don't want a medal, sir. I just want to fly." The colonel was quiet for a moment. "You will, but not for a while. Medical says you're grounded for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer depending on how that wrist heals. After that, we'll see." 6 weeks felt like a lifetime, but Kavar knew better than to argue with medical restrictions. She nodded, and the colonel left, but not before telling her that half the pilots on base wanted to visit, and that she should prepare for a lot of unwanted attention. He wasn't exaggerating. Over the next week, while Kavar was confined to the hospital recovering, a steady stream of visitors filtered through. Ortiz came by with a group of Apache pilots, bringing food from the dining facility that was marginally better than hospital rations. Torch, the Harrier pilot, brought a book and sat with her for an hour, not saying much, but offering the kind of quiet companionship that meant more than words. Even Haddock, the F-15E pilot who'd questioned her competence, stopped by. He stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable and finally said, "I was wrong about you, Kavar. What you did out there, that wasn't luck. That was skill and guts, and a level of airmanship most of us will never reach. I'm sorry for what I said." Kavar looked at him, this man who'd built his identity around speed and altitude and precision strikes from safe distances, and saw something genuine in his expression. "Apology accepted, Major," she said, "but you weren't entirely wrong. The A-10 is a gun truck with wings. That's exactly what it is, and that's exactly what makes it effective." Haddock nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his face. "Yeah, well, it takes a particular kind of person to fly a gun truck into a firefight and come out the other side. I'm glad you're one of ours." He left, and Kavar sat alone in the hospital room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the trajectory that had brought her here. From Split to the United States, from a Z-Lin 242 trainer to an A-10 Thunderbolt II, from invisibility to a call sign that ground commanders requested by name. She hadn't sought any of it, hadn't campaigned for recognition or status. She'd just flown mission after mission, putting ordnance on target and bringing the aircraft home. But somewhere along the way, she'd become something more than just a pilot. She'd become a symbol, a proof of concept, a demonstration that competence could overcome bias, and that the most important thing wasn't who you were but what you could do when everything was on the line. The recognition felt strange, uncomfortable even, but she couldn't deny that it mattered. Not for her sake, but for the pilots who would come after her, the ones who would face the same skepticism, the same underestimation. If her story made their path easier, if it opened doors that had been closed, then maybe all of this meant something beyond the immediate missions. 6 weeks later, Kavar was cleared to return to flight status. Her wrist had healed, her ribs had knit, and the concussion had resolved without complications. She walked back onto the flight line on a morning when the sky was clear and the air smelled of jet fuel and possibility. And when she saw the waiting for her in the revetment, she felt something settle into place inside her chest. The crew chief, the same one who'd maintained her previous aircraft, walked over with a grin. "Welcome back, Captain. This one's fresh out of depot maintenance, fully upgraded avionics package. Figured you deserved the best after what you did." Kavar walked around the aircraft, inspecting it with the same meticulous attention she gave every pre-flight check. It looked identical to the one she'd crashed. Same ugly lines, same 7-barrel cannon, same titanium bathtub. But it felt different somehow, like it carried the weight of expectation along with the ordnance. She climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and ran through the startup checklist. The engine spooled up with a sound that was as familiar as her own heartbeat, and when she taxied out to the runway, she felt the world narrow down to the essential things. The aircraft, the sky, the mission waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. The tower controller's voice came through her headset, professional but warm. "Reaper 7, you're cleared for takeoff. Good to have you back." Kavar advanced the throttles, feeling the A-10 accelerate down the runway, and at exactly the right moment she pulled back on the stick. The aircraft lifted off, climbing into the clear Afghan sky, and for the first time in 6 weeks, everything felt right again. She flew a standard patrol that day, nothing dramatic, just overwatch for a convoy moving through a known high-risk area. But the ground commander, hearing her call sign, requested her by name, and when the convoy reached its destination without incident, he thanked her over the radio with a warmth that suggested her reputation had preceded her. Over the next 3 months, Kavar flew another 42 missions, each one executed with the same precision that had become her trademark. She didn't crash again, didn't take catastrophic battle damage, but she continued to put herself between ground forces and danger with a consistency that made her the most requested close air support pilot in the theater. The medals came eventually: a Distinguished Flying Cross for the Canyon mission, an Air Medal with Valor for the crash landing, and a handful of others that accumulated in her service record like benchmarks of a career that had shifted from invisible competence to undeniable excellence. But the medals weren't what mattered to her. What mattered was the voice of a ground commander calling for fire support and knowing she could deliver it. The deployment ended in August, and Kavar rotated back to the United States with her squadron, returning to a base in Nevada where the mountains looked similar but the stakes were different. She expected to slip back into obscurity, to become just another pilot in a peacetime rotation, but the story had traveled ahead of her. The aviation community, both military and civilian, had latched onto the narrative of Reaper 7, the Croatian immigrant who'd flown an A-10 into the ground and walked away, who'd saved SEALs and soldiers, and earned the respect of men who'd initially dismissed her. Reporters requested interviews, aviation magazines wanted to profile her, and the Air Force Public Affairs Office saw an opportunity to showcase the kind of story that made good recruiting material. Kavar declined most of it. She wasn't interested in being a spokesperson or a symbol, but she agreed to speak at the Air Force Weapons School, where the next generation of fighter pilots were learning their craft, because she thought maybe her experience could teach them something useful. The auditorium was packed, every seat filled with pilots in flight suits, their faces young and hungry and skeptical in the way that only people who haven't been tested yet can be. Kavar stood at the podium looking out at them, and for a moment she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. Then she started talking, and the words came easier than she'd expected. She told them about the canyon, about the hydraulic failure, about the moments when everything hung in the balance, and the only thing that mattered was training and judgment, and the willingness to stay in the fight when every instinct screamed at you to run. She didn't make it sound heroic. She made it sound hard, complicated, the kind of work that required constant attention and a willingness to accept that mistakes could be fatal. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then one of the students, a young lieutenant with a call sign patch that read "Wrench," raised his hand. "Ma'am, how did you stay calm? When the hydraulics failed, when you knew you were going down, how did you keep it together? Kavar thought about that, about the cold certainty of knowing she was about to die and the way training had overridden fear. I didn't stay calm, she said honestly. I was terrified, but fear doesn't make decisions and panic doesn't fly aircraft. So I focused on the things I could control and ignored everything else. Another student, a captain who looked like he'd already seen combat, spoke up. Do you think the A-10 is still relevant? With modern air defenses, with peer adversaries, does it have a place? Kavar smiled faintly. The A-10 is relevant as long as we're putting troops on the ground in contested environments. It's not the aircraft you'd send against integrated air defenses or advanced fighters. But for close air support, for keeping soldiers alive when they're pinned down and out of options, there's nothing better. The platform is old, but the mission hasn't changed. People still need fire support, and the Warthog still delivers it better than anything else. The questions continued for another 30 minutes, and when the session ended, a line of students formed, waiting to shake her hand, to ask follow-up questions, to tell her that her story had changed the way they thought about their own flying. Kavar stood there, patient and generous with her time, and tried to internalize the fact that she'd become the thing she'd never sought to be. A role model, an example, a standard against which others would measure themselves. The months turned into years, and Kavar's career continued on a trajectory that seemed inevitable in retrospect, but had felt uncertain at every step. She was promoted to major, then to lieutenant colonel, given command of her own A-10 squadron, and eventually assigned to a staff position at Air Combat Command Headquarters, where she helped shape doctrine for close air support and joint terminal attack controller integration. She flew less, which hurt, but she influenced more, which mattered. And through it all, the story of Reaper 7 persisted, told and retold in ready rooms and briefing spaces, passed down from one generation of pilots to the next. The details changed in the telling, embellished and compressed, but the core remained. A pilot who'd been underestimated, who'd proven herself when it mattered most, and who'd become a symbol of what competence looked like when stripped of pretension and ego. Years later, when Kavar finally retired, the ceremony was held at Nellis Air Force Base, and the crowd included pilots she'd flown with, ground commanders she'd supported, and students she'd taught. Master Chief Del Vecchio was there, older now but still carrying himself with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life in hard places. He found her after the ceremony, and they stood together looking at the static display of an A-10, one of the last remaining Warthogs still in service. You know, Del Vecchio said quietly, I've worked with a lot of pilots over the years. Fast movers, rotary wing, special operations aviation, but I've never forgotten that night in the canyon. The way you flew, the way you put yourself between us and everything that wanted us dead, that's the kind of thing that stays with you. Kavar looked at the A-10, at the 7-barrel cannon, at the scars and patches that marked a lifetime of service. I was just doing my job, she said. Del Vecchio shook his head. No, ma'am, you were doing it better than anyone else could have, and that made all the difference. They stood there in silence, and Kavar thought about the trajectory that had brought her from a shelled airfield in Split to this moment, standing in the Nevada sun with a career's worth of memories behind her. She thought about the pilots who would come after her, the ones who would face skepticism and bias and the weight of others' low expectations. And she hoped that maybe, in some small way, her story would make their path easier, would prove that competence was what mattered, that skill transcended background, and that the sky belonged to anyone willing to earn their place in it. The sun set over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of copper and gold, and Reaper 7's story became part of the mythology of military aviation, a legend built from moments of extraordinary performance under pressure, a reminder that heroes weren't always the loudest or the fastest or the most decorated. Sometimes they were the quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones who just kept flying, mission after mission, until the day they looked back and realized they'd changed everything.